Hi, I'm John Frederickson, and welcome again to the ICDP Institute. In our first video on anxiety, we showed you the symptoms of anxiety, which are triggered by the somatic, sympathetic, and parasympathetic nervous systems in the body. Now, we'll teach you how to regulate anxiety. To regulate anxiety, though, first you have to identify it. So as soon as you see any sign of elevated anxiety, check it out. Ask your patient, are you aware of feeling anxious right now? The patient can respond in only one of two ways. The patient may respond that she is aware of feeling anxiety, so you can go ahead and regulate it. Or the patient may respond with a defense, which either prevents anxiety regulation or makes the anxiety even worse. So let's go through these responses so you can help your patients more effectively. So you might start with, are you aware of feeling anxious? And the patient says, no. Now you might think, hey, I know what that is. That's denial. Well, maybe not. It may be that the patient isn't aware of her anxiety because she doesn't pay attention to her bodily symptoms. So in response, you might say, well, you look a little anxious. Are you aware of any signs of anxiety in your body? And the patient says, no, I'm just a little sick to my stomach. Therapist, well, that's a sign of anxiety. So we see that as soon as we were looking at your anger toward your husband, you became anxious and got a little sick to your stomach. Do you see that sequence now? Here, we label the patient's anxiety so she can recognize when she's anxious. Then we point out causality. She had a feeling, it triggered anxiety, and anxiety created the symptom of being sick in her stomach. Often, just this amount of explanation is enough to make the patient's anxiety come down and her stomach symptoms disappear. When the patient begins to see the pattern of feeling, anxiety, and symptoms, she can see that her anxiety is predictable, understandable, and treatable. Let's go to a second example. You ask the patient if she's aware of feeling anxious, and she responds, yes, but what I want to talk about is a conflict I have at my job. Here, the patient changes topics. That's the defense of diversification. The problem, however, is that she uses this defense to ignore her anxiety in this moment. You see, if she ignores her anxiety right now, we can't regulate it right now. And if we don't regulate her anxiety symptoms will get worse during the session. And letting her anxiety get worse would be a way to neglect the patient. So rather than listen to her conflict at work, assess her anxiety first to make sure it's safe to explore any topic. So when she says, yes, but what I want to talk about is the conflict I have at my job, you could say, I'd love to hear about that in a moment, but first, could we take a look at your anxiety? Are you aware of feeling anxious right now? Block any defense that prevents your patient from paying attention to and regulating her anxiety. Then you can invite her to pay attention to her anxiety. Almost all anxiety regulation requires that the patient pay attention to an anxiety symptom in her body. Let's take a look at another example. Suppose you ask the patient, are you aware of feeling anxious? And the patient responds, I'm just afraid I'll fail my test later this week. This is a defense. Rather than describe how she experiences her anxiety, she describes a thought she has. Further, this thought, rumination, has a terrible side effect. It perpetuates her anxiety. It's absolutely essential to block this defense. Otherwise, the patient's rumination will keep her anxiety chronically elevated. So, when she says, I'm just afraid I'll fail my test later this week, you can interrupt her and say, I'd love to hear about the test later, but right now, could we pay attention to your body? How do you experience this anxiety physically in your body? Stopping the rumination and focusing her attention on her bodily symptoms of anxiety will calm her down quickly. Sometimes therapists say, but isn't it rude to interrupt the patient? But you see, when defenses like rumination or self-attack perpetuate the patient's anxiety, it would be cruel not to interrupt. We never interrupt the patient, but we should interrupt the defense that hurts the patient. So, in summary, if the patient seems too anxious, assess her anxiety. If she's not aware of her anxiety, direct her attention to it so she can regulate it. If she uses a defense to ignore her anxiety, block the defense and invite her to pay attention to her anxiety. If she uses a defense that perpetuates her anxiety, block the defense, invite her to pay attention to her anxiety. In the next video, we'll show you how to assess if anxiety is too high for effective therapy. In the meantime, feel free to check out my psychotherapy video on working with a highly anxious patient at www.istdpinstitute.com. In the meantime, thanks so much for visiting us, and I'm John Frederickson at the ISTDP Institute.